There we go. Good. Hello, Moji, who just joined. Very happy to be here this morning, and well, for me. This is the first of a series that from the Rotary Peace Fellowship Alumni Association, we're calling a dialogue series. And the idea for this series is to identify issues that are of relevance to the work we all do, and that for which different Peace Fellows have expressed interest in addressing, in deepening, and create these spaces with experts and practitioners that are outside our Rotary Peace Fellowship network, so we can benefit from these exchanges and see where we can go together, if anything. So in that context, at our last career development series, which was on working for or with grassroots organizations, the issue of decolonizing aid was brought up by many participants as a key issue to address, particularly when discussing the financial constraints of working with a small with grassroots organizations. And so in that context, an old boss of mine and a fantastic peace builder, Rich, sent me an email. Well, Neil shared the decolonizing report with the group of people who participated there at that event. And then an old boss of mine told me, hey, if you're interested in learning more about this work on this report, I know the main author. And I'm like, well, that's precisely what we're discussing. And that's how we built that bridge. And we reached out to Shannon, who very kindly and generously accepted to be here this morning. So I will quickly introduce our guest speaker, or our guest. This is a dialogue, right? Shannon is a policy associate at Peace Direct. She leading efforts on issues including decolonizing aid and peace building, improving local ownership in peace processes, and US peace building. Prior to that, she was working with Peace Direct as a Scoville Peace Fellow. She holds a BA in International Studies and Arabic from Kenyon College, where she wrote her senior capstone on how public perceptions of migrant, domestic, and sex workers impact the hostility of the legal system in their destination countries. Prior to joining Peace Direct, she interned at a number of small international nonprofits, most recently at New Light, a not-profit based in Kolkata, India, that works with migrant sex workers. So without further ado, I will first off thank Shannon so much, and then pass the floor to Neil Delahaye, who will be facilitating this dialogue today. So thanks so much, both of you. Over.
Thank you, Bob, actually, for all of your amazing work in organizing this event. And of course, thank you, Shannon, for accepting to be our guest and to honor us with your presence today. So I think that after your presentation of the report, I'm sure that we will have many questions to ask you, because this is going to shake some of the grounds that we were made to be used by a certain system that exists. But maybe as guiding questions, I'd like to ask you, what were the initial visible problems that led your organization to start tackling this issue? And of course, then we'll see that many of the invisible layers got to be published and visibilized thanks to you. But what were those initial problems? And could you share some of the findings that you find critical to be addressed as priority.
Thank you so much, Bao, Nil, everybody else. It's such a privilege to be able to speak with you all, morning my time. So Peace Direct is an organization that has for a long time, our entire mission, our ethos, is focused around shifting power to those most proximate and most affected by conflict, because we believe that they have the solutions, and people who are experiencing conflict are already creating solutions and addressing it. So how can we as the international community better support them? And so that's really the framework that our organization is coming to this issue with. And so, I joined Peace Direct in August of 2020, and there were ongoing conversations internally about what it actually meant to shift power. We have a number of partners in 13 countries around the world, and they're incredibly brilliant, they're doing incredible work. And yet it is still helpful for us to have an office in Washington, D.C. It is still helpful for us to have an office in London, in the United Kingdom. And so we're really grappling with some of the clear power dynamics that are still existing in what we were attempting to create in our horizontal relationships. And so there is that. And then there's also, I think, following the events of last summer in the United States, following the murder of George Floyd, race was a topic that had previously been largely absent from conversations except in private spaces, and it was suddenly brought to the fore. And so, our CEO and our executive director in the United States were having all these conversations with various members of senior staff talking about race and how we could engage with it and address it. And then I came in, and I have a bit of a background doing some work on ethnic conflicts and just bringing different groups together. And so it just was a natural fit for us to do some research and see how we could begin having this conversation. And so in November of 2020, actually right around the time of the US election, so it was a very tense time here in DC, we held a 3-day consultation with participants from all over the world, people who self-identified as academics or activists or everything in between. And we had this conversation about what would it mean to shift power, and we termed it Decolonizing Aid and Peace Building. And it was a really fruitful, really rich conversation over those 3 days. And we found that we honestly didn't have enough time to cover everything that people wanted to talk about. So yeah, to go over to your second question, Nil, I'll just start talking a little bit about some of our key findings. And I think it's important to begin, and I always want to make sure, but when I'm having this conversation, that we're all on the same page as to what I mean and what our organization means when we're saying decolonizing. Because without, a shared terminology, very quickly we fall into some issues. And so for us, we found it to be a useful term to describe the process by which formerly colonized regions are attempting to, reject and change their relationships with other parts of the world. And so we use terminology such as global north and global south in deference to where they were created, the fact that those are terms that came out of academic studies and academic collaborations between folks from, various countries that in the now global south who were trying to find a way to explain their relationship to the rest of the world, trying to explain their particular experience. And so decolonizing for us is shifting that power, creating these more horizontal relationships, and addressing the fact that there is a colonial legacy, there is an imperial legacy, and that has ongoing ramifications in the way that we relate to one another in terms of countries and the ways that, INGOs relate to individual practitioners. So during the report, some key things that came up were the colonial roots of the peace building system. We think of ourselves as good people, which I think for the most part is true. I think we're drawn to this work because we genuinely want to make this world safer. We don't want others to be living in conflict. We truly believe that everyone has the right to a life lived in dignity. However, we don't exist in a vacuum, And so I think what came up a lot during the consultation was this idea of peace building as neutral, this idea of peace building as apolitical, and the fact that that's fundamentally untrue. Even in terms of our history, as peace building exists, it's a colonial concept, and the frameworks we use, the modalities we use, a lot of these are rooted in very Western understandings of the world and conflict in general. And so, that people really wanted us to challenge ourselves and to challenge each other to recognize the fact that no one is apolitical, no one exists in places neutrally. And so how can we move beyond those false paradigms? Another thing that came up a lot was the idea of structural racism. And so how deeply embedded into our system racial hierarchy is. And so we see that with anecdotal stories about young upstart people who just graduated from insert whatever Ivy League in the United States. They go to a country, I'm uncomfortable. I'll just use my own background. Like they'll go to somewhere in the Caribbean, and then they will say, "Oh, well, I'm better suited to lead this project than you," even though they're 23, they have no experience, they've never been to the region, don't speak the language, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so a lot of practitioners, local practitioners, talked about being in these really uncomfortable positions where their funding was contingent on having a supervisor who was from, who was not from the region, and how so often there were these dynamics that existed where, so much of the relationship was casual and would happen outside of hours and would happen in these hotels and around drinks. And so if you were somebody who didn't drink or didn't, have the funds necessarily to be spending money in that particular way, you would find yourself missing out on funding opportunities that you never even knew were actual opportunities that existed. And so the subtle ways and not so subtle ways that racism and these hierarchies and privileging is built into our system. And so, it creates this dynamic where local practitioners find themselves having to play the system, having to change their own behaviors to suit the norms and behaviors of external actors. And we see that especially around funding and especially around a lot of the restrictions that are put on funding. So we probably can talk about that more. I'm sure people will want to get into that specifically, but it's a really key issue. Another issue is language. That's why I started with just creating a shared understanding. We use terminology that is deeply, deeply problematic because the implications of a lot of the things that we say are not so pretty. For lack of a better term, let's start with capacity building. We love to talk about capacity building. There is an inference when we say capacity building that the communities that we're going to have no capacity, and by capacity we mean skills, have no abilities. So we're saying that we are teaching them, we are imparting something to them that they, without us, do not have and do not have the ability to develop. And so the thing is, obviously, at times there are skills trainings, practical skills that some people may not have, but that isn't the same thing as fundamental capacity to address an issue. It is disingenuous to pretend otherwise, and it is, disempowering to those communities, not necessarily for them and their own experience, but how we view them. And how we view people affects how we relate to them, affects how we fund them, affects the amount of power and leadership we're willing to actually extend to them when it comes to these projects. And so, really when we're thinking about our language creates our reality. And we saw that come up again and again. Obviously, there are other terms that people found really they really struggled with, even just the terminology of aid, and we received a lot of pushback on the term decolonizing, which I welcome, and I would love if people today also wanted to push back. I think, I'm always re-examining my relationship to that particular word, and it is useful, but we're going to have to abandon some of our words, and I think peace building in particular, that is a term that we might have to consider not retiring, but being willing to not use, because what is and what isn't peace building is not something that for a lot of people is commonly known. And I know that as somebody who's in the process of trying to develop U.S. peace building programming for Peace Direct, in the United States, peace building does not resonate. So we have people that I would term peace builders. They wouldn't term themselves that. They would refer to themselves as activists. They would refer to themselves as, change makers, perhaps. And so what value is there in me demanding or insisting that they use my framework? And so how can we move beyond those limitations? Some other key findings: program and research design, entirely rooted in Western concepts and Western knowledge and Western academia. So, we see that this means that local knowledge ends up being devalued. COVID-19 has been an unexpected opportunity for us to, and I say us, I really mean those of us based in the global north, for us to be forced to trust our partners all around the world because we couldn't travel. And so it was a really interesting moment where a lot of the limitations and restrictions that were previously put upon local researchers were suddenly lifted. And we had to ask ourselves these questions. Well, if we didn't need 10 pages of paperwork following every single day of programming during COVID, did we ever need that much paperwork following programming? You know, like, what constraints have we created and normalized and not even questioned? You know, we enter this field and we don't ask ourselves, well, is that actually serving us? And so program design, research design, there's so many things that just inadvertently end up meaning that we can say, oh, well, that's proof they couldn't fill out this very complicated, very sector-specific, jargony piece of paperwork. So clearly that means that they're not qualified or competent enough to then lead a program. When in fact, what we're actually asking, those are very separate things. Those are very particular skills. So we come back to skills building. If we want to do skills building around this paperwork, that's a very specific thing. But we tend to extrapolate when it comes to local communities. We tend to make assumptions around trustworthiness. We make assumptions around issues of corruption, especially when it comes to financing, as to why we can't fund local peace builders. So there are implications to a lot of those things. And when we unpick it and when we unravel it over the course of the 3 days of our consultation, we found what is lying underneath oftentimes are really racist views. And so, you know, I can get into examples when we're having our conversation, but I think it is challenging. Obviously, those who hold multiple marginalized identities, so women, queer people, we're talking, you know, people with disabilities, and people who are also young people, perhaps, or older people over a certain age. We find that the trust, the lack of trust, the lack of perceived competence, the lack of even respect that they received during their work, all of that was magnified. And so I think it's really, really crucial for us to consider that, yes, we need to talk about race, we need to talk about our own positionalities, but we cannot forget to include an intersectional approach and include other aspects that are going to change how people are related to. I mean, some of the stories that were shared during the consultation by some of the female peace builders were harrowing, to be honest. And, you know, I think it is really important that we not shy away from some of the more uncomfortable conversations. For example, here today I'm speaking. This is an open conversation to, you know, alums. However, there's no interpretation. So if you are not competent or comfortable in English to a degree, you won't be able to join this conversation. I also want to note, if you hold a disability, for example, if you're part of the deaf community or you're hard of hearing, you will not be able to participate in this conversation. There is no interpretation that we have facilitated. These are simple ways. I mean, there are financial constraints, of course, but these are very common ways that we, even for all of our good intentions, inadvertently end up saying who is and who is not welcome in the room, who is and who is not valuable, or who we expect to be a peace builder. And so I will just keep our findings to that and then open up to some conversation.
Thank you very much, Shannon, for this great introduction on your report. So actually, I just want to start our conversation with one question. Now I think we get to stop the recording, and Chatham House